Hi, welcome to Lies and Secrets channel. We hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. It was a Wednesday evening, the kind that usually blends into the background of life, unremarkable and forgettable. But this particular Wednesday would become a turning point in my story, a day that would change everything. I remember it vividly, standing in our kitchen, absent-minded, stirring a pot of soup. The rich aroma of vegetables and herbs filled the air, but my mind was far from the task at hand. My husband Arthur had just dropped a bombshell over dinner. His younger sister Sophia had recently graduated from law school and apparently needed a place to live, but this wasn't a simple request for her to stay in our spare room or crash on the couch for a few weeks. No. Arthur had decided that Sophia should have our house, our home, my home. I paused, my stirring, the wooden spoon hovering over the gently bubbling soup. What do you mean she needs our house? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt strange in my mouth, as if I were speaking a foreign language. Arthur had always been dismissive of my accomplishments, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. It wasn't just a preference for his family. It was outright absurdity. I stared at him, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what he was suggesting. Our kitchen, once a place of warmth and comfort, suddenly felt cold and alien. The yellow walls that I had painstakingly painted myself seemed to close in on me, the collection of mismatched mugs hanging from hooks. Each one a memory from our travels, now felt like strangers watching this surreal scene unfold. I waited for Arthur to laugh, to say it was all a joke. But his face remained serious, his blue eyes holding mine with an intensity that made me shiver. This was real. He really expected me to give up our home, for his sister Sophia has a future ahead of her. Arthur said, his tone matter of fact, as if he were discussing the weather. What do you do? Emma, you lounge around here all day. This house would finally be useful in her hands. His words stung like a physical blow. I gripped the edge of the counter, feeling the smooth, cool surface beneath my fingers. It anchored me as I fought to keep my composure. I thought about all the hours I'd spent making this house a home, the weekends spent gardening, coaxing life from the once barren backyard. The nights I'd stayed up late, poring over interior design magazines to create the perfect living space. And now Arthur was dismissing it all as lounging around. I took a deep breath, inhaling the comforting scent of the soup. It reminded me of my grandmother who had taught me this recipe. The same grandmother who had left me this house in her will long before Arthur and I were married. This house is legally mine. I said, my voice stronger than I expected. I inherited it from Gran. You know that. Arthur's face darkened at my words. Calm, albeit domineering man I had known for years seemed to vanish, replaced by someone I barely recognized. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching beneath the skin. Temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. You're being selfish, Emma, he spat, his voice rising. Sophia needs this opportunity. She's going places. You're just here. Each word was like a dagger, precise and cruel. I felt something inside me begin to crack. Years of suppressed anger, hurt and resentment bubbled to the surface. I turned away from him, unable to bear the sight of his face any longer. No. I muttered the word, slipping out almost involuntarily. It was quiet, barely audible, but it felt monumental. For the first time in our marriage, I was saying no to one of Arthur's demands. I moved towards the dining room, intending to clear the dishes and give myself a moment to think. That's when it happened. The slap came out of nowhere, a sudden explosion of pain across my cheek. The force of it sent me stumbling backward, my hip colliding painfully with the edge of the table. For a moment everything seemed to freeze. Ticking of the clock on the wall became deafening. In the sudden silence I raised a trembling hand to my face, feeling the heat radiating from my skin where Arthur's hand had connected. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze. His eyes were wide, a mix of shock and something else, something darker, swirling in their depths. I said nothing. What was there to say this moment? This action had shattered whatever illusions I might have still harbored about our marriage. Okay. I whispered the word, tasting like ash in my mouth, without another glance. At Arthur. I walked to our bedroom, closing the door softly behind me. Inside, I sank onto the bed, my mind reeling. The room that had once been our sanctuary now felt like a prison. Photos of Arthur and me smiled down from the walls, mocking me with memories of happier times. Had they ever really been happy, or had I just been fooling myself all along? I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror across the room. A red mark was blooming on my cheek, a stark contrast to my pale skin. I touched it gently, wincing at the tenderness. This wasn't the first time Arthur had lashed out physically, but something felt different. This time a line had been crossed, one that couldn't be uncrossed. As I sat there, the reality of my situation began to sink in. Arthur had always been controlling, always put his family's needs above mine, but this was a new level of disregard for me as a person, as his wife. He was willing to give away my home, my inheritance, without a second thought. I thought about Sophia, Arthur's younger sister. We had never been close, but I had always tried to be kind to her. She was bright and ambitious, qualities I had once admired. Now the thought of her moving into my home, sleeping in my bed, cooking in my kitchen made me feel physically ill. The sound of Arthur moving around in the kitchen drifted through the closed door. He was acting as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just hit me and tried to give away my house. The normalcy of it was almost more shocking than the slap itself. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The fan spun lazily overhead. Its gentle whirring, a stark contrast to the turmoil in my mind. What was I going to do? The thought of confronting Arthur again made my stomach churn, but the idea of meekly accepting his decision of packing up my life and handing over my home to Sophia was equally unthinkable. As the night wore on, I remained in the bedroom, my mind racing. Arthur never came to check on me, never apologized. The distance between us, both physical and emotional, felt insurmountable. In the early hours of the morning, as the first hints of dawn began to color the sky, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here, couldn't continue living this life. The realization was both terrifying and oddly liberating. For years I had been slowly disappearing, becoming a ghost in my own life. It was time to reclaim myself, to find the woman I used to be. Before Arthur had slowly chipped away at my confidence and self-worth. I got up quietly, moving to the closet. My hands shook as I pulled out a small suitcase hidden behind years of accumulated clutter. I had bought it on a whim years ago, dreaming of vacations we never took. Now it would serve a different purpose. As I began to pack, a plan started to form. In my mind it wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is. I glanced at the door half, expecting Arthur to burst in at any moment. But the house remained quiet, holding its breath. As I took the first steps towards my freedom, the breaking point had come and gone. Now it was time for action. The days that followed were surreal, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I moved about quietly, my face still tender from Arthur's slap, but my resolve firmer than ever. Arthur had long stopped apologizing for his actions. It was clear he didn't regret them. Instead, he made plans to help Sophia move in by the following week, his confidence bolstered by my silence. I played my role well, nodding where necessary, moving about without protest to an outsider. It might have seemed like I had accepted Arthur's decision, that I was preparing to gracefully exit my own home. But inside I was a whirlwind of emotions and plans. In the dark hours of the night, while Arthur slept soundly, I began preparing for my departure. It wasn't a retreat, born of weakness, but a strategic removal of myself from a situation that had long drained my spirit. I started with the things Arthur wouldn't notice, a few books here, some jewelry there, important documents carefully removed from our filing cabinet. I packed my belongings in small, unobtrusive increments, ensuring Arthur wouldn't notice the slowly emptying closet. It was a delicate balance. I needed to take enough to start my new life, but not so much that it would raise suspicion. Every night I would lie awake, listening to Arthur's steady breathing, my heart pounding as I planned my next move. During the day I maintained an air of normalcy. I cooked meals, cleaned the house, and even listened to Arthur's excited chatter about Sophia's impending arrival. but my eyes constantly scanned our home, cataloging what I would take and what I would leave behind. The house which once held so much warmth for me, family photos, heirlooms, years of careful care and love, no longer felt like it belonged to me. As I dusted the mantelpiece, my fingers lingering on the frame of our wedding photo, I felt a pang of sadness, not for the loss of Arthur or our marriage, but for the life I had thought we were building together. I remember standing in the kitchen one afternoon, washing dishes as I had done countless times before. The sunlight streamed through the window, catching on my grandmother's old china displayed in the cabinet. I had always loved those dishes with their delicate blue pattern. Now I wondered if Sophia would use them, if she would know the stories behind each chip and crack. As I dried my hands, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. The bruise on my cheek had faded to a sickly yellow, but the memory of that night was still fresh. I touched my face gently, feeling a surge of determination. I wouldn't let this be my story. I wouldn't let Arthur's actions define me. That night I made my first concrete move towards freedom, while Arthur was engrossed in a football game. I slipped into our home office and logged into our joint bank account. With shaking hands, I transferred a significant portion of our savings into a new account I had secretly opened. It wasn't everything. I wasn't trying to bankrupt Arthur, but it was enough to give me a start in my new life. As the days passed, I found myself becoming hyper-aware of Arthur's presence in the house. Every footstep, every door closing, every sigh set my nerves on edge. I was terrified he would discover my plans before I was ready, but Arthur, caught up in his excitement about Sophia's arrival, seemed oblivious to the changes happening right under his nose. One evening, about 6 days after Arthur's announcement, I overheard him on the phone with Sophia. He was in his study, the door slightly ajar, his voice carrying down the hallway, everything said Em. He was saying, his tone jovial. Emma's been great about the whole thing. I told you she'd come around. I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding. Arthur's words confirmed what I had suspected. He had no idea of the storm brewing inside me in his mind. I was the compliant wife, always ready to bend to his will. The urge to burst into the room and confront him was almost overwhelming, but I held back, reminding myself of my plan. Patience. I told myself, just a little longer. That night I lay awake long after Arthur had fallen asleep. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting strange shadows on the walls. I thought about the life I was leaving behind, the good and the bad. I thought about the friends. I'd have to say goodbye to the neighbors who had become like family. Would they understand why I had to leave, or would Arthur's version of events paint me as the villain? As dawn broke, I made my final preparations. I had already packed most of my clothes and personal items into my car bit by bit over the past few days. Now I just had a few last things to take care of. I wrote a letter to my closest friend Evelyn, explaining everything. I asked her to look out for a package I would mail to her. Contained some of my most precious possessions, things I couldn't risk Arthur finding if he somehow intercepted my departure. I sealed the letter and slipped it into my purse, planning to mail it on my way out of town. Next I went through the house one last time, saying a silent goodbye to each room. In the living room I paused by the bookshelf, running my fingers along the spines of the books we had collected over the years. So many memories were tied up in these pages. I selected a few favorites to take with me, carefully packing them into a small box in the kitchen. I hesitated by the china cabinet. My grandmother's dishes gleamed in the early morning light. For a moment I considered taking them, but something stopped me. Let Sophia have them, I thought. Let her wonder about their history, about the woman who once cherished them as the sun rose higher in the sky. I knew it was time. Arthur would be waking up soon for work. I had to be gone before then. I took one last look around the bedroom, my eyes landing on Arthur's sleeping form. Despite everything, a part of me ached at the sight of him. We had shared so much in this room, laughter, tears, dreams for the future. But those dreams had turned to dust, blown away by years of small cruelties and one final unforgivable act. I picked up my purse and the small box of books, then made my way downstairs. At the front door, I paused, my hand hovering over the polished wood. This was it, the moment of no return. A bittersweet smile played on my lips as I turned the lock for the last time, but I wasn't quite finished. There was one last thing to do. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a single note. It was short, firm, and I knew it would be devastating. I left it on the counter for Arthur to find propped against the coffee maker, where I knew he'd see it first thing. Then, without looking back, I walked out of the house and into the cool morning air. The street was quiet, most of my neighbors still asleep or just beginning to stir. I got into my car, which was parked a block away to avoid suspicion, and started the engine. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of our house, no Arthur house, now in the rear-viewed mirror. It looked the same as it always had, the blue shutters I had painstakingly painted last summer, the flower boxes bursting with color, the welcome mat that proclaimed "Home Sweet Home" in cheery letters. But for me, it was no longer home. Home was somewhere ahead of me now, a place I had yet to find. I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of fear and exhilaration. The road stretched out before me, full of possibilities. I didn't know exactly where I was going or what challenges lay ahead. But I knew one thing for certain. I was free, and that was enough for now. As the familiar streets of my neighborhood gave way to the highway, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The quiet exit I had planned for days was finally complete. Now it was time to start my new chapter on my own terms. The sun was high in the sky when Sophia's car pulled into the driveway of what she believed would be her new home. The house looked just as she remembered from her occasional visits. A charming 3-story colonial with blue shutters and flower boxes bursting with colorful blooms. Sophia took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming roses. This was at her new beginning. As she stepped out of the car, her heels clicking on the pavement, Sophia felt a surge of excitement. Through years of hard work in law school, countless sleepless nights, and the stress of bar exams, she was finally ready to start her career, and thanks to her brother Arthur's generosity, she had a beautiful home to start this new chapter of her life. Sophia, Arthur's voice boomed across the yard as he emerged from the front door, a broad grin on his face. "Welcome home, sis." Sophia rushed forward, throwing her arms around her brother Arthur. "Thank you so much for this. I still can't believe it's real." Arthur chuckled, patting her back. "Believe it, kiddo, you've earned it now. Let's get you settled in." As they walked into the house, Sophia's eyes darted around, taking in every detail. The entryway was bright and welcoming, with an elegant mirror hanging on one wall and a small table adorned with a vase of fresh flowers on the other. The hardwood floors gleamed in the sunlight, streaming through the windows. "It's even more beautiful than I remembered," Sophia breathed, running her hand along the banister of the staircase. "Where's Emma? I want to thank her too." A flicker of something annoyance discomfort passed over Arthur's face, but it was gone so quickly. Sophia wasn't sure she'd seen it at all. "She's gone," Arthur said, his tone suddenly flat. "I told her this arrangement was best for everyone." Sophia frowned slightly but didn't press the matter. She had always sensed tension between Arthur and Emma, but she had chalked it up to normal marital stress. Now she wondered if there was more to the story, but the excitement of the moment pushed those thoughts aside. "Well, let me show you around," Arthur said, his cheerful demeanor returning, "though I'm sure you'll be redecorating soon enough to suit your tastes." They moved through the house, Arthur pointing out various features and sharing anecdotes. Sophia tried to focus on his words, but she couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Something felt off. The house was immaculately clean, but it felt empty, not just in the physical sense, but as if the soul of the home had been stripped away. In the master bedroom, Sophia's unease grew. Closet doors stood open, revealing rows of empty hangers. The dresser drawers were partially open, clearly. "Emptied, Arthur," she said. Slowly, "Where are Emma's things?" Arthur shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "She took what she needed, said she wanted to make room for you." Sophia's excitement was rapidly giving way to confusion and a gnawing sense of guilt. This didn't feel right. She had been so caught up in her own joy at having a place to live that she hadn't stopped to consider what it meant for Emma. "Arthur, are you sure Emma was okay with this maybe? I should find my own place." "Don't be ridiculous." Arthur cut her off, his tone sharp. "This is your home now." Emma understood that this was best for everyone now. "Why don't you start unpacking? I'll order us some dinner." Still uneasy, Sophia nodded and began the process of moving in. She brought in her suitcases from the car, feeling strange as she hung her clothes in the closet that had so recently held Emma's belongings. As she arranged her toiletries in the bathroom, she couldn't help but notice the single toothbrush in the holder, the empty spaces where Emma's products had once stood. The house felt like a stage set, everything arranged perfectly but lacking the warmth of a real home. Sophia tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself she was being silly. This was a wonderful opportunity. She should be grateful, not questioning her brother's generosity. As the afternoon wore on, Sophia continued to settle in. She arranged her law books on the shelves in the study, set up her laptop on the desk, and pinned her law school diploma to the wall with a sense of pride. This was what she had worked so hard for: a successful career, a beautiful home. So why did it all feel so wrong? The sound of the doorbell startled her from her thoughts. "I'll get it," she called out to Arthur, who was in the kitchen. Sophia opened the front door to find a middle-aged woman standing on the porch, a covered dish in her hands. "Oh," the woman said clearly. "Surprised? I'm sorry, I was expecting Emma. I'm Margaret from next door. I brought over a casserole. I always make extra on Wednesdays, and Emma usually." Sophia's heart sank. "I'm Sophia, Arthur's sister. I'm staying here now. Emma's gone." Margaret's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked like understanding tinged with sadness. "I see," she said quietly. "Well, welcome to the neighborhood, Sophia. I hope you'll enjoy the casserole." As Sophia took the dish, she couldn't help but notice the way Margaret's eyes darted past her, searching the house behind her. "Thank you," Sophia said, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. "It's very kind of you." Margaret nodded her smile, not quite reaching her eyes. "If you need anything, we're just next door. And if you hear from Emma, well, tell her we're thinking of her as." Margaret walked away. Sophia closed the door, leaning against it with a sigh. Casserole felt heavy in her hands, a tangible reminder of the life she had displaced. She carried it to the kitchen where Arthur was scrolling through his phone. "Who was that?" he asked, without looking up the neighbor. "Margaret, she brought a casserole for Emma." Sophia set the dish on the counter. "Arthur, I think we need to talk about Deshay." Arthur interrupted, his eyes lighting up as he looked at his phone. "The movers can come tomorrow to get the rest of Emma's things. We'll have the place fully yours in no time." Sophia opened her mouth to protest, to ask more questions about Emma's sudden departure, but Arthur was already moving on, chattering about dinner options and plans for the weekend. She felt swept along in his enthusiasm. Her doubts pushed aside once again. As evening fell, Sophia found herself in the kitchen searching for plates to serve dinner. She opened cabinet after cabinet, each one revealing neatly organized dishes and glassware. It was in the last cabinet that she found something unexpected: a set of beautiful china with a delicate blue pattern. As she carefully lifted one of the plates, she noticed a small chip on the edge, a tiny imperfection that somehow made the dish feel more real, more loved. She wondered about the stories behind these dishes. Had they been wedding gifts, family heirlooms? She imagined Emma using them for special occasions, carefully washing and storing them after each use. The thought made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. It wasn't until she was setting the table that Sophia noticed the letter. It was propped against the coffee maker, Emma's elegant handwriting clearly visible on the envelope. "Arthur," she called out, excitement bubbling up inside her. "There's a letter here for me." She thought it must be a kind gesture from Emma. A welcome note perhaps, or some advice for starting her new life in this home. Sophia's fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the envelope. This was a confirmation that Emma was truly okay with this arrangement, that Sophia wasn't an intruder in someone else's life. But as she unfolded the letter and began to read, her heart sank. The words on the page were not at all what she had expected. Emma's tone was calm and measured, but there was an undercurrent of cold fury that made Sophia's blood run cold. "Dear Sophia," it began, "you've always had the world handed to you on a silver platter courtesy of your brother. But this house, it was never his to give, and it never will be as the sole owner of this property. Let me clarify my intentions. You will not live here, and neither will he. There is no generosity left to give. After years of exploitation, the house has been sold. The new owners move in tomorrow. Consider this my final gift to a family that has taken far more than it ever deserved." Sophia gasped the letter, slipping from her trembling fingers. "Arthur," she cried out, her voice shaking. "Arthur, you need to see this." Arthur appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with anger as he snatched the letter from Sophia's hands. His eyes scanned the page, his expression darkening with each word. "What the hell does she mean? Sold?" he roared, crumbling the paper in his fist. Sophia watched in stunned silence as the reality of the situation dawned on her brother piece by piece. Emma had left nothing, not the house, not even a forwarding address. She had severed every tie she had to this life, leaving Arthur and Sophia in shocked disbelief. As Arthur's rage filled the kitchen, Sophia sank into a chair, her mind reeling. The beautiful dream of her new life was crumbling around her, replaced by a nightmare of uncertainty and guilt. What had really happened between Arthur and Emma? And more importantly, where would they go now? The sound of shattering glass made Sophia jump. Arthur had smashed a vase against the wall, his face contorted with fury and humiliation. Outside lights flickered on in neighboring houses, curious faces peering out windows. The commotion. Sophia felt tears welling up in her eyes. This was not how her new beginning was supposed to go. As she watched her brother rage and the neighbors whisper, she realized that she had been an unwitting pawn in a game she didn't understand, and now she was left to deal with the consequences of choices that were never truly hers. To make the kitchen fell into an eerie silence. Following Arthur's outburst, the shattered remains of the vase lay scattered across the floor. Physical manifestation of the chaos that had just erupted in their lives. Sophia sat frozen in her chair, her eyes fixed on the crumpled letter in Arthur's trembling hand. The words she had read moments ago echoed in her mind, each syllable a dagger of reality, cutting through the illusion of her perfect new beginning. Arthur paced the kitchen, his face a storm of emotions, anger, disbelief, and something Sophia had never seen in her brother before. "Fear, this can't be happening," he muttered, more to himself than to Sophia. "She can't do this, she wouldn't dare." Sophia found her voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. "Arthur, what's going on? What did Emma mean about the house being sold?" Her brother's head snapped up, his eyes wild for a moment. Sophia thought he might lash out at her too, but instead he slumped against the counter, the fight seeming to drain out of him. "I don't know. I don't know." The vulnerability in his voice scared Sophia more than his anger. Arthur had always been the strong one, the one with all the answers. To see him so lost, so defeated, made the situation feel all the more dire. A knock at the door startled them both. Arthur straightened up, running a hand through his hair in a futile attempt to compose himself. "I'll get it," he said. His voice hoarse. Sophia followed him to the entryway, hanging back as Arthur opened the door. On the porch stood Margaret, the neighbor, who had brought the casserole earlier. Behind her were several other people Sophia didn't recognize: an older man with a stern expression, a younger couple holding hands, and a woman in her 40s clutching a small dog to her chest. "Is everything all right?" Margaret asked, her eyes darting between Arthur and Sophia. "We heard shouting and a crash." Arthur forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Everything's fine, Margaret, just a little family disagreement, nothing to worry about." The older man stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Where's Emma?" "Arthur? We haven't seen her in days." Sophia watched as her brother's facade cracked slightly. She's gone away for a while. Needed some time to herself. You know how it is. A murmur ran through the small crowd. The woman with the dog spoke up, her voice laced with suspicion. That's not like Emma at all. She would have told us if she was going somewhere. Look, Arthur said, his tone sharpening. I appreciate your concern, but this is a private matter. Emma is fine, and that's all you need to know. The neighbors exchanged glances, clearly unconvinced. Sophia felt a surge of sympathy for them. They were worried about their friend, and Arthur's evasiveness was only fueling their concerns. I'm sorry, Sophia said, stepping forward. We're all a bit overwhelmed right now, Emma left unexpectedly. We're still trying to figure things out ourselves. Her honesty seemed to soften the neighbors' expressions somewhat. Margaret reached out and squeezed Sophia's hand. If you need anything, dear, we're here, and if you hear from Emma, please let us know she's okay. As the group reluctantly dispersed, Sophia closed the door, leaning against it with a sigh. Arthur, we need to talk about this, really. Talk. Her brother nodded, the fight gone out of him. They made their way back to the kitchen, carefully stepping around the broken glass. Sophia began to clean up the mess while Arthur retrieved the letter, smoothing it out on the table. Read it to me, Sophia said softly, all of it. Maybe we missed something. Arthur cleared his throat and began to read aloud. As Emma's words filled the air, Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. The letter was more than just a goodbye. It was an indictment. Years of resentment, of feeling used and undervalued, poured out in carefully chosen words. Emma spoke of Arthur's controlling nature, of feeling like a ghost in her own home. She detailed the gradual erosion of her self-worth, the constant prioritization of Arthur's family over her needs. When Arthur's voice faltered, Sophia glanced up to see tears in her brother's eyes. It was a shocking sight. She had never seen Arthur cry before. I didn't know she felt this way, he said, his voice barely audible. Sophia felt a complex mix of emotions swirling inside her: anger at Arthur for his treatment of Emma, guilt for her own role in this mess, and a deep sadness for the pain that had clearly been festering in this family for years. Arthur, she said gently, did you really think Emma would be okay with giving up her home, her inheritance? Her brother's shoulders slumped. Don't know what I thought, that she'd understand that family comes first, but Emma was family too, Sophia pointed out, or she should have been. Arthur didn't respond. His eyes fixed on the letter Sophia read over his shoulder, focusing on the part about the house being sold. Arthur, is this true? Could Emma really have sold the house? He nodded. Slowly, the house, it was hers, an inheritance from her grandmother. I always resented that. I guess felt like she had one foot out the door. The irony of his words wasn't lost on Sophia. By trying to control Emma to tie her more firmly to him by giving away her home, Arthur had instead pushed her to leave entirely. As the reality of their situation sank in, Sophia felt a wave of panic. What are we going to do? Where are we going to go? Arthur stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. No, this isn't happening. She can't do this to us, to you. I'm calling our lawyer. Sophia watched as her brother stormed out of the kitchen, phone in hand. She turned back to the letter, reading it again more carefully. Something about Emma's words nagged at her. This wasn't a spew-off-the-moment decision. Emma had planned this meticulously, probably for weeks or even months. As she pondered this, Sophia's eyes fell on the china cabinet. The beautiful, blue patterned dishes she had admired earlier seemed to mock her. Now they were Emma's. Course family. Heirlooms. Most likely. Sophia wondered if Emma had considered taking them or if leaving them behind was part of her final message to Arthur. The sound of Arthur's raised voice drifted from the study. Sophia could make out fragments of the conversation: legal terms, threats of lawsuits, demands for information. But underlying it all was a note of desperation that made her heart ache. She stood up, drawn to the window outside. The neighborhood was quiet, but she could see lights on. In several houses were the neighbors talking about them, speculating about what had happened to make Emma leave. So suddenly Sophia felt exposed, as if the walls of the house had suddenly become transparent. A car drove slowly down the street and Sophia tensed. Was it the new owners coming to claim their property, or perhaps Emma having second thoughts? But the car moved on and Sophia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Arthur's voice rose again, and this time Sophia could clearly hear his words. "What do you mean?" "It's ironclad. There has to be something we can do." Sophia sank back into her chair, the weight of their situation pressing down on her. This house, which just hours ago had represented her bright future, now felt like a trap. Every corner held a memory that wasn't hers, every surface a reminder of the woman whose life she had unknowingly disrupted. As the night wore on, Sophia and Arthur remained in a state of suspended animation. They moved around the house like ghosts, unable to settle, unable to plan. The letter lay on the kitchen table, a silent accusation that neither of them could bear to touch again. Around midnight, exhaustion finally overtook them. Arthur collapsed onto the couch in the living room while Sophia retreated to the guest bedroom. She couldn't bring herself to sleep in Emma's bed. Felt too much like an invasion as she lay in the unfamiliar bed. Staring at the ceiling, Sophia's mind raced. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? Just this morning, she had been full of hope and excitement for her new life. Now, she felt adrift, her future as uncertain as it had been the day she graduated from law school. She thought about Emma, wondering where she was now. Was she feeling triumphant, relieved, or was there a part of her that regretted her decision? Sophia couldn't help but admire the older woman's courage, even as she grappled with the consequences of her actions. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, Sophia made a decision. She couldn't stay here in this house, built on resentment and misunderstanding. Whatever happened next, she knew she needed to forge her own path separate from the tangled web of her brother's marriage. With this resolution came a small measure of peace. Sophia closed her eyes, finally drifting into a fitful sleep. Tediora would bring new challenges, but for now she allowed herself to rest, the weight of Emma's letter finally lifting from her shoulders. In the quiet of the early morning, the house seemed to exhale, as if relieved to have its secrets finally brought to light. The letter on the kitchen table fluttered slightly in the breeze from an open window. Its job done, its message delivered. The next chapter of this family story was yet to be written, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The harsh light of morning brought no relief to Arthur and Sophia as they stumbled into the kitchen, bleary-eyed and disoriented. The reality of their situation hit them anew. The letter still lay on the table, a silent reminder of the upheaval in their lives. Arthur reached for the coffee maker, his movements mechanical. "I couldn't sleep," he muttered, not meeting Sophia's eyes. Kept thinking there must be some way out of this. Sophia sank into a chair, watching her brother. The anger from last night seemed to have drained out of him, leaving behind a shell of the confident man. She knew. "What did the lawyer say?" she asked, dreading the answer. Arthur's shoulders slumped as he turned to face her coffee. "Forgotten. It's ironclad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma owned the house outright. She had every right to sell it. The finality of those words hung in the air between them. Sophia felt a lump forming in her throat. "So what do we do now?" Before Arthur could answer, a knock at the door made them both jump. They exchanged a worried glance before Arthur moved to answer it. Sophia, close behind, standing on the porch, was a middle-aged couple, their expressions a mix of excitement and awkwardness. "Hi there," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Teddy, and this is my wife, Evelyn. We're the new owners." Arthur's face paled, but he managed to shake Tom's hand. "Arthur," he said shortly, "this is my sister Sophia." Evelyn's eyes darted between them, her smile faltering. "We're so sorry for the confusion. When we bought the house, we were told it would be vacant. We had no idea." Sophia stepped forward, plastering on a smile. She didn't feel it's not your fault, she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. We're the ones who should apologize. We'll be out of your way as soon as possible. Teddy nodded, clearly relieved. We appreciate that we don't want to rush you, but we were hoping to start moving in today. Our lease on our apartment ends tomorrow and we've got movers scheduled. Arthur, who had been silent, suddenly sprang into action, of course. Course we'll get our things packed up right away. Just give us a few hours. As Teddy and Evelyn retreated to their car, promising to return later, Arthur closed the door and leaned against it. His eyes closed. A few hours. He repeated, his voice hollow. How are we supposed to pack up our lives in a few hours? Sophia felt a surge of determination. This wasn't how she had imagined starting her new life, but she was nothing if not resilient. We'll manage, she said firmly. We don't have a choice. The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. Sophia and Arthur moved through the house like whirlwinds, throwing clothes into suitcases, packing books and personal items into boxes, scrounged from the recycling bin. Every now and then one of them would pause, holding some object that held a particular memory or significance. Sophia found herself in front of the china cabinet, staring at the blue patterned dishes she had admired. Just yesterday, Arthur, she called out. What should we do with these? They're Emma's, aren't they? Arthur appeared in the doorway, his face unreadable. Leave them, he said after a moment. They were her grandmother's, she should have them. As Sophia carefully closed the cabinet, she felt a pang of sadness. These dishes, like so much in this house, represented a life and a history she would never be part of. By early afternoon, they had managed to pack most of their belongings. The house, which had felt so warm and inviting just yesterday, now echoed with emptiness. Arthur made one last call to his lawyer, but the news remained the same. There was nothing they could do. As they carried the last of their boxes out to their cars, the neighbors began to gather on their lawns, watching with undisguised curiosity. Sophia could hear snippets of their conversations, speculations about what had happened to cause such a sudden move. Margaret, the kindly neighbor from yesterday, approached them hesitantly. Is everything all right? She asked, her eyes filled with concern. This all seems so sudden. Arthur opened his mouth to respond, but Sophia cut in smoothly. We've had a change of plans, she said, forcing a smile. Sometimes life takes unexpected turns, you know? Margaret nodded, though she didn't look convinced. Well, if you need anything at all, you know where to find us. As they finished loading their cars, Teddy and Evelyn pulled up a moving truck close behind the contrast. Between their excitement and Arthur and Sophia's detection was palpable. All set? Teddy asked, his tone caught between sympathy and eagerness to start moving in. Arthur nodded terse, handing over the keys. It's all yours, he said, his voice flat. Enjoy the house. As Teddy and Evelyn began directing the movers, Arthur and Sophia stood on the sidewalk watching as strangers began to fill the space that had just hours ago held their hopes and dreams. Where will you go? Sophia asked, quietly, realizing she hadn't even thought to ask until now. Arthur ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration Sophia had seen 1,000 times before. I've got a friend who says I can crash on his couch for a while. You? Sophia thought of her tiny studio apartment back in the city, the one she had been so eager to leave behind. Back to my place. I guess it's small, but it's paid up for the next month. They stood in silence for a moment, the reality of their situation sinking in. Everything had changed so quickly and neither of them was quite sure how to process it all. I'm sorry, Arthur said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I was doing the right thing. Sophia reached out and squeezed her brother's hand. I know, she said softly, we both made mistakes, but we'll figure it out. As they prepared to part ways, Sophia couldn't help but think of Emma. Where was she now? Did she know the chaos she had left in her wake? Part of Sophia wanted to be angry, to blame Emma for upending their lives, but another part of her, a part that was growing stronger by the moment, understood Arthur. She said as they stood by their cars. I think we owe Emma an apology." Her brother's face hardened for a moment, but then he sighed the fight going out of him. "Maybe you're right," he admitted. "But first, we need to figure out our own lives." With one last look at the house, at the life that could have been, they got into their separate cars. As Sophia pulled away from the curb, she caught sight of Teddy and Evelyn in her rear-view mirror. They were standing on the porch, arms around each other, smiling as they watched their belongings being moved in. Sophia felt a pang of envy, quickly followed by a surge of determination. This wasn't the end, she told herself. It was a setback, yes, but also an opportunity, a chance to start over, to build a life on her own terms. As she drove away from the neighborhood, leaving behind the dreams of yesterday, Sophia made a silent promise to herself. She would learn from this experience, grow from it, and someday she would have a home of her own, one built on honesty, respect, and true understanding. The fallout from Emma's letter was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more difficult conversations, and hard decisions to make. But as Sophia merged onto the highway heading back to her small apartment in the city, she felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on with the resilience and determination that had gotten her through law school. And maybe, just maybe, this unexpected turn of events would lead her to a future brighter than she could have imagined. As the sun rose over a bustling city street, Emma stood at the window of her small apartment, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands. The view was nothing like the tranquil suburban landscape she had left behind, but the energetic hum of the city below filled her with a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in years. It had been 3 weeks since she had walked away from her old life, leaving behind a house full of memories and a marriage that had slowly suffocated her. The first few days had been a blur of emotions, relief, fear, exhilaration, and doubt, all swirling together in a dizzying cocktail. But as the days passed, Emma found herself settling into a new rhythm, one that was entirely her own. Her new apartment was modest, a far cry from the spacious house she had shared with Arthur. But as Emma looked around at the space she had carefully arranged, she felt a surge of pride. Every item here was chosen by her, every decision made without having to consider anyone else's opinion. The freedom was intoxicating. Emma set her coffee down and moved to the small desk. Tucked into the corner of the living room, she booted up her laptop mentally, preparing herself for the day ahead. Finding a job at her age with a resume full of gaps where she had been a homemaker was proving to be a challenge. But Emma was determined. She had skills, she had experience, and most importantly, she had a newfound determination that refused to be dampened. As she scrolled through job listings, Emma's mind wandered back to the day she had left. She wondered how Arthur had reacted when he found her letter. Had he been angry, surprised? Or had he, on some level, seen it coming? And Sophia? Emma felt a twinge of guilt when she thought of Arthur's sister. She hadn't meant to disrupt the young woman's life, but she couldn't bring herself to regret her actions. Sometimes, you had to put yourself first. A notification popped up on her screen, pulling Emma from her reverie. It was an email from her realtor confirming that the sale of the house had been finalized. Attached was a note that brought an unexpected lump to Emma's throat. The new owners love the home. They're starting a family there. I thought you'd like to know. Emma leaned back in her chair, a mix of emotions washing over her. Part of her was glad to know that the house would be filled with love and laughter again. Another part ached for the life she had once imagined having there, but mostly she felt a sense of closure. The house was no longer her burden, her prison. It was someone else's fresh start. With a deep breath, Emma turned back to her job search with renewed focus. By mid-morning, she had submitted applications to several local businesses and nonprofits. As she was about to close her laptop, an ad caught her eye. Volunteers needed at Oak Community Center help empower women in need. Something about the ad resonated with Emma. Before she could second-guess herself, she picked up her phone and dialed the number listed. An hour later, Emma found herself standing in front of a weathered brick building, nervousness and excitement battling in her stomach. The woman who greeted her at the door had a warm smile that immediately put Emma at ease. "You must be Emma," she said, extending her hand. I'm Ava, we're so glad you called. We can always use more help around here. As Ava led her through the community center, Emma felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in a long time: purpose. The center offered a variety of services: job training, counseling, childcare, and support groups for women dealing with everything from domestic violence to career changes. Most of our volunteers have been through tough times themselves, Gloria explained. As they toured the facilities, it helps them relate to the women we serve. Everyone here has a story. Emma nodded. Thinking of her own story, the years of feeling invisible, of having her opinions dismissed, of slowly losing herself in Arthur's shadow, she thought of the strength it had taken to walk away, to choose herself over the comfortable familiarity of an unhappy marriage. I think I might have something to offer, Emma said softly. Ava's smile widened. I think you just might, she agreed. Over the next few weeks, Emma fell into a new routine. Mornings were spent job hunting and afternoons at the community center. She started by helping with administrative tasks, but soon found herself drawn to the women who came through the center's doors. Each story she heard resonated with her own experience in some way, and Emma found that sharing her own journey often helped others find the courage to make changes in their lives. One afternoon, as Emma was helping a young mother fill out job applications, she caught a glimpse of herself in a mirror hanging on the wall. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had left that suburban house a month ago. This Emma stood taller, her eyes brighter, her smile more genuine. The bruises Arthur had left, both physical and emotional, were fading that evening. As Emma walked home from the community center, she found herself taking a detour through a small park. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Emma sat on a bench, watching as dog walkers and joggers passed by, each absorbed in their own little worlds. For the first time since she had left, Emma allowed herself to really think about Arthur and the life she had left behind. She wondered if he had tried to contact her, if he had finally understood why she had to leave. Part of her hoped he had, that maybe her actions had forced him to confront his own behavior, but another part of her realized that it didn't really matter anymore. Arthur's journey was his own now, just as this new life was hers. As she sat there, lost in thought, a young couple walked by hand in hand. They were laughing about something. Their faces lit up with joy and love. Emma felt a pang in her chest, not of jealousy or regret, but of hope. Maybe someday she would find that kind of partnership, one built on mutual respect and understanding. But for now, Emma was content with the company she kept her own. She was rediscovering herself, peeling back layers of compromise and silence to find the woman she had always been underneath. It wasn't always easy. There were nights when the loneliness felt overwhelming, when the magnitude of starting over in her 49s seemed insurmountable, but those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Emma stood up from the bench, stretching her arms above her head. She had a busy day tomorrow, a job interview in the morning and a support group to lead at the center in the afternoon. The thought filled her with anticipation rather than dread. Walking back to her apartment, Emma felt a sense of peace settle over her. The city around her was alive with possibilities, each street a potential new adventure. She wasn't naive enough to think that everything would be smooth sailing from here on out. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt. But for the first time in years, Emma felt equipped to handle whatever life threw her way. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Emma's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Ava at the center. The women from today's group wanted me to tell you how much your story inspired them. You're making a real difference here, Emma. Emma felt a warmth spread through her chest as she read the message. She was making a difference not just in other women's lives, but in her own. Every day was a step further from the life she had left behind and closer to the one she was building for herself. Entering her apartment, Emma was struck by how much it already felt like home. It wasn't just the physical space, but the feeling of safety and autonomy it represented. Here she was free to be herself, to make her own choices, to live life on her own terms. As she prepared for bed that night, Emma caught sight of a small box tucked away in the corner of her closet. contained a few mementos from her old life photos, trinkets, small reminders of the years she had spent with Arthur. She had brought them with her, unsure if she would want them in this new chapter of her life. Emma knelt down and opened the box, sifting through its contents. Each item held a memory, some painful, some bittersweet. But as she looked at them now, Emma realized they no longer held power over her. They were simply parts of a story, her story, but they didn't define her anymore. With a small smile, Emma closed the box and slid it back into the closet. Maybe someday she would look at those mementos again, but for now she was focused on creating new memories, new stories to tell. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Emma felt a sense of gratitude wash over her, gratitude for the strength she had found within herself, for the new connections she was making, for the opportunity to redefine her life on her own terms. Tedioro was a new day full of possibilities, and Emma was ready to embrace them. My story ends here. If you feel that this story is meaningful and brings useful lessons, please like and subscribe to the channel to support me. Thanks for listening and see you in the next videos.